When Dr. Elena Petrova proposed her solo expedition to map unexplored Arctic ice caves, the International Polar Research Institute's review board rejected her proposal immediately. "Your methodology is recklessly dangerous," stated review chairman Dr. Richard Harmon while denying critical funding and equipment access. Solo exploration in those conditions reflects poor judgment rather than scientific dedication. Despite having completed more successful Arctic expeditions than any researcher in the Institute's history, Petrova was restricted to analyzing satellite data at the main research station, a thinly veiled demotion that relegated the world's most experienced female Arctic explorer to what colleagues called desk duty. 3 months into this assignment, when the Institute's all-male elite survey team failed to return from their own expedition and stopped transmitting from a remote region Petrova had specifically warned was dangerously unstable, emergency protocols were initiated, with conditions rapidly deteriorating and temperatures plummeting to P60 for perf. Conventional rescue was deemed impossible. Any extraction attempt would require at least 72 hours to mobilize, stated the emergency committee, but the team has approximately 34 hours of survival time remaining. It was at this moment that security cameras captured Dr. Petrova calmly accessing the equipment lockup, methodically gathering the supplies she'd been denied, and departing alone into the Arctic darkness. What followed would be described by polar survival experts as beyond the boundaries of human capability, as the woman they deemed recklessly dangerous navigated a landscape considered unsurvivable to reach 12 men, given up for dead. International Polar Research Institute, Svalbard Station. Present day. Dr. Petrova. The board's decision is unanimous. Dr. Richard Harmon announced with the practice authority of someone accustomed to final judgments. Your proposed solo mapping expedition to the Nordenskiöld ice cave system is denied on safety grounds. Elena Petrova maintained perfect composure, her weathered features betraying none of the frustration she felt. At 38, she had spent more time in the Arctic's most extreme environments than anyone else at the Institute, male or female, with a safety record that remained unmatched despite conditions that had claimed the lives of less experienced explorers. "The safety protocols I've outlined exceed Institute standards by significant margins," she responded evenly. "The data opportunity in that unexplored system could revolutionize our understanding of historical ice formation patterns. The potential scientific value isn't in question," Harmon replied, glancing toward the other board members for confirmation. "It's your methodology. Solo expedition into unmapped terrain during early season conditions represents an unacceptable risk profile." Catherine Chen, the only female board member present, attempted to offer a more balanced perspective. "Elena's previous expeditions demonstrate exceptional risk management in similar conditions, perhaps with additional support personnel. Additional personnel would compromise the minimal environmental impact approach," Petrova interjected, her Russian accent becoming slightly more pronounced as it always did when discussing technical details. "The cave structures show signs of fragility that make single explorer methodology optimal." Harmon's expression hardened at this challenge to the board's assessment. "Petrova, while your cold weather experience is acknowledged, your continued insistence on solo operations suggests a concerning pattern of unnecessary risk-taking rather than sound scientific judgment." The implication was clear. If unspoken, the qualities that would be celebrated as bold exploration in her male colleagues were being reframed as reckless endangerment when applied to her. It was a pattern Petrova had encountered throughout her career, from her initial training at Moscow's Arctic Institute to her current position as the only female senior researcher at the prestigious International Polar Research Institute. "The proposal is rejected," Harmon concluded with finality. "Your expertise remains valuable to the Institute. You'll be reassigned to the satellite monitoring team effective immediately." The reassignment was a transparent demotion, shifting the world's most experienced field researcher to a desk position analyzing data that could be processed by graduate students. As the board members filed out, only Dr. Chen remained behind, her expression conveying apologetic understanding. "This isn't about safety protocols, Elena," she said quietly once they were alone. "Your methodology is sound. This is about—" "I know what it's about," Petrova replied calmly, gathering her rejected proposal materials. "The same thing it's always about." Over the following weeks, Petrova performed her reassigned duties with the meticulous professionalism that characterized her entire career. The satellite monitoring role, analyzing ice pattern formations and movement from remote sensing data, was critically important work that benefited from her field experience. However, it utilized only a fraction of her capabilities while confining her to the main research station. From her workspace, overlooking the station's main operations center, Petrova observed the preparations for the expedition that had been approved instead of her own. The elite survey team's multi-year project mapping climate impacts across the northern archipelago. The all-male, 6-person team received extensive resources, equipment access, and support personnel for what was considered the Institute's flagship research initiative. "Quite the hero's send-off," commented Dr. Chen, joining Petrova as they watched the team's departure preparation. "Though I notice they're taking the exact route through the Nordenskjöld region that you proposed as too unstable for large team operations." Petrova nodded slightly, her attention on the equipment being loaded. "They've reduced the safety margin on their supply calculations," she noted with professional concern. "Standard protocol for those conditions would require at least 40% redundancy. They're operating at approximately 2. Should we say something, Chen?" "I submitted my assessment to Harmon yesterday," Petrova replied. "He indicated that the elite team's leader has a different risk assessment methodology appropriate for their objective." The diplomatic phrasing didn't disguise the reality. Her expertise was being systematically disregarded, despite having the most extensive field experience in the region. As she continued monitoring satellite data in the following weeks, Petrova identified concerning patterns in the ice formations along the elite team's route, early season instabilities that matched her original warning about the region's unsuitability for large team exploration. Following protocol, she filed updated risk assessments and suggested route modifications. Each was acknowledged, filed, and effectively ignored as the elite team continued their planned trajectory into increasingly questionable terrain. "Your persistence is admirable," Harmon remarked after her third update, his tone conveying anything but admiration. "But the elite team has state-of-the-art equipment and significant experience. Your concerns, while noted, reflect an abundance of caution that would unnecessarily limit their research objectives." Petrova recognized the subtext. Her female perspective was being dismissed as overcautious, in contrast to the bold, risk-taking approach celebrated in her male counterpart. Rather than engaging in a fruitless debate, she focused on what she could control, continuing her satellite monitoring with the methodical precision that had defined her career, while privately maintaining her own assessment of developing conditions. 6 weeks into the elite team's expedition, the first indication of trouble arrived with characteristic subtlety. During routine communications, the team reported minor equipment issues and slight delays due to unexpected terrain challenges, precisely in the region Petrova had flagged as problematic. Within the Institute's operations center, these developments were treated as standard expedition adjustments, rather than precursors to potential crisis. Only Petrova, with her extensive field experience, recognized the concerning pattern forming in both the team's communications and the satellite data she continued monitoring. The ice shelf they were traversing showed signs of accelerated instability, microscopic indicators visible in the high-resolution imagery that most analysts would miss, but that Petrova had learned to identify through years of direct observation. "They're moving into increasingly dangerous conditions," she informed Dr. Chen during their daily research review. "The ice formation patterns indicate potential for significant structural failure, within the next 72 hours. They need to alter course immediately. Chen studied the satellite imagery with concern. I don't see how Harmon can dismiss this evidence. It's right here in the data. The data requires field experience to properly interpret. Petrova replied, already preparing yet another formal assessment for submission. From satellite imagery alone, these formations appear stable to standard analysis. Her updated risk assessment, submitted through proper channels with the highest priority designation, received the same response as previous warnings. Polite acknowledgement followed by effective dismissal. The elite team continued their planned route, unaware that they were moving into what Petrova recognized as an increasingly catastrophic situation. When the crisis finally materialized, it did so with the sudden violence characteristic of Arctic disaster. The elite team's emergency beacon activated at 0347 hours, transmitting for approximately 8 minutes before falling silent. Fragmentary communication indicated catastrophic terrain collapse. Exactly the scenario Petrova had warned about, with the team's position now uncertain, and their survival equipment compromised. The Institute's Emergency Response Committee convened immediately, with Petrova included based on her knowledge of the region, rather than her official position. The satellite imagery, now supplemented with emergency response resource, confirmed her worst assessment. The ice shelf had experienced massive structural failure, stranding the team in a newly formed island of ice, with temperatures plummeting toward 60 feet and an Arctic storm system approach. Conventional rescue operations would require a minimum of 72 hours to mobilize appropriate resources, stated the emergency coordinator grimly. Based on their last communication, the team has suffered equipment damage that limits their survival time to approximately 34 hours in current conditions. The implications were clear to everyone in the emergency center. By the time a standard rescue operation could reach them, the elite team would likely have perished from exposure. The harsh mathematics of Arctic survival left no room for conventional solutions. As the committee debated increasingly desperate theoretical options, Petrova quietly reviewed the detailed maps she had created of the region during previous expeditions. Her mind calculated routes, supply requirements, and survival probabilities with the focused precision developed through decades in the world's most unforgiving environments. There is a potential approach, she finally stated, interrupting the increasingly circular discussion. A single-person intervention could reach their position within the survival window using the northeast traverse route. Dr. Harmon's dismissal was immediate and definitive. Absolutely not. That route is classified as extreme risk even in optimal conditions. In current weather patterns, it's suicidal. I've navigated that traverse in similar conditions, Petrova responded calmly, with appropriate equipment and knowledge of the terrain features not visible on standard mapping. It's viable for experienced person. By experienced personnel, you mean yourself, Harmon stated flatly. After we explicitly rejected your solo methodology as recklessly dangerous, you're now proposing an even more extreme version of the same approach. Petrova met his gaze direct. I'm proposing the only option that gives those 12 researchers any chance of survival. The debate that followed was brief but intense, with the emergency committee ultimately reaching the same conclusion that had defined Petrova's entire career. Her approach was deemed unnecessarily risky, despite being the only viable solution given the time constraint. Official protocol would be followed, with conventional rescue resources mobilized despite the mathematical certainty that they would arrive too late. As the meeting concluded and emergency procedures were initiated, Petrova quietly left the operations center. Her decision had already been made, not in that room, but in the moment. She had calculated the survival probabilities and recognized that only immediate intervention could prevent the deaths of 12 fellow researchers. Within 20 minutes, security cameras would capture her methodically accessing the equipment storage area, gathering the specialized survival gear she had been denied for her own expedition, and departing into the Arctic darkness without authorization. By the time her absence was discovered, Elena Petrova would be beyond recall, embarking on what polar survival experts would later describe as the most extraordinary solo rescue in Arctic history. The Arctic landscape beyond the research station represented one of Earth's most unforgiving environments, a realm where human survival calculations were measured in hours rather than days, and where the slightest miscalculation or equipment failure resulted in death with absolute certainty. It was precisely this environment where Elena Petrova had established her reputation as the Institute's most accomplished field researcher, though that expertise had been systematically minimized by the current leadership. As she moved swiftly away from the station's perimeter lights into the encompassing darkness, Petrova's mind was wholly focused on the complex survival calculations that would define the next 34 hours. The specialized equipment she had acquired, some officially requisitioned, some borrowed from storage, represented the minimal essential tools for what she was attempting. Her route would follow the northeastern traverse, a treacherous path through pressure ridges and unstable ice formations that conventional expedition protocols classified as extreme risk. What those protocols failed to account for was Petrova's unique knowledge of the terrain's microfeatures, subtle indicators invisible on standard maps that created viable passages through seemingly impassable barriers. The first 6 hours of her journey proceeded with the methodical efficiency that characterized her approach to Arctic navigation, moving with controlled speed that balanced urgency against sustainable energy expenditure. Petrova covered ground that would have been challenging for a fully equipped team, much less a solo traveler, in deteriorating condition. At the research station, her absence had now been discovered, triggering predictable institutional responses. The emergency communication system crackled to life in her specialized headset. "Petrova, this is Harmon. Return to base immediately. You are in direct violation of explicit orders and safety protocols." She acknowledged the transmission without slowing her pace. "Unable to comply. I'm approximately 24 kilometers northeast on direct intervention route to elite team position. Will maintain communication as conditions permit." "This is not authorized." Harmon's voice conveyed both anger and underlying concern. "Current conditions make your route unsurvivable even with your experience level. You're endangering yourself without improving the team's survival probability." "Assessment incorrect." Petrova responded with the calm precision that defined her communication style, even in extreme conditions. "My calculations indicate 72% probability of reaching team within survival window. If pace maintained, we'll update at next checkpoint." As Harmon continued attempting to order her return, Petrova adjusted her communication system to monitoring mode, receiving transmissions without requiring response. The growing Arctic storm was beginning to affect signal quality anyway, making extended communication increasingly impractical. The conditions deteriorated rapidly. As she pushed deeper into the Arctic wilderness, temperatures plummeted to wind 60 above EP, with wind chill factors pushing effective exposure conditions even lower. Visibility reduced to less than 20 meters in swirling snow, with terrain features obscured by accumulation that would have disoriented less experienced navigators. For Petrova, however, these conditions represented familiar challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. Her navigation methodology relied on subtle environmental indicators rather than conventional visual landmarks. Pressure patterns in snow accumulation, wind-carved features in ice formations, and the specialized intuition developed through years of direct experience in similar conditions. 12 hours into her unauthorized rescue attempt, Petrova reached the first critical decision point, a massive pressure ridge that satellite data had identified as a major obstacle. The conventional route would require circumnavigation, adding approximately 6 hours to her journey, time the stranded team didn't have. Instead, Petrova implemented the specialized ice traverse techniques she had developed during previous expeditions. Using modified climbing equipment configured for unstable ice structures, she established a direct route through the ridge's most vulnerable section, a passage that wouldn't appear viable to standard assessment, but that her experienced analysis identified as navigable. The traverse required every element of her specialized training: technical ice climbing in extreme cold, weight distribution adaptations for unstable surfaces, and the precise movement timing that prevented structural collapse. Each meter gained represented both physical achievement and validation of the expertise that had been dismissed by the Institute's leadership. At the research station, satellite monitoring continued tracking her progress, with a mixture of professional concern and growing astonishment. The route she was navigating had been classified as impassable in current conditions by every standard assessment protocol, yet the tracking beacon showed steady advancement at a pace that defied conventional calculation. Chen remarked, studying the tracking data with increasing hope. The rate of progress suggests she could reach the team's position within the survival window. Dr. Harmon remained skeptical despite the evidence. The most dangerous sections are still ahead. No solo traveler has ever successfully navigated the Nordenskjöld compression zone in storm conditions. The unspoken addition, that no one had ever attempted it, remained hanging in the tense atmosphere of the monitoring center as the Institute's emergency response team continued mobilizing conventional rescue resources that everyone recognized would arrive too late. All attention focused on the single tracking beacon moving steadily through terrain considered unsurvivable. 18 hours into her journey, with approximately 30 kilometers remaining to the team's last known position, Petrova encountered the environment's most formidable challenge: the Nordenskjöld compression zone. This chaotic region of colliding ice formations created a labyrinthine barrier of unstable structures, hidden crevasses, and unpredictable collapse patterns that had claimed the lives of numerous explorers over the decade. In optimal conditions, navigating this zone required specialized equipment and multiple safety personnel. In the current storm conditions, with temperatures continuing to drop and visibility near zero, conventional assessment deemed it absolutely impassable. What the conventional assessment couldn't account for was Petrova's unique methodology. Not merely her technical skills, but her fundamental approach to Arctic navigation that differed from traditional technique, where standard protocols relied on visual landmarks and predetermined routes. Petrova had developed a system based on interpreting the ice's structural language, the subtle patterns and formation behaviors that revealed hidden pathways invisible to less experienced observers. Pushing through conditions that would have forced any other rescuer to turn back, Petrova navigated the compression zone with a combination of technical precision and intuitive understanding that transcended formal training. Each decision point required instantaneous assessment of ice stability, structural integrity, and collapse probability calculations. She performed automatically after decades in similar environments. At the research station, Dr. Chen watched the tracking data with growing amazement. "She's through the compression zone," she announced to the monitoring team, maintaining forward progress at approximately 1.8 kilometers per hour despite conditions that should make movement impossible. Harmon studied the data with grudging reassessment. The storm intensity is increasing. Even if she reaches their position, extraction becomes a separate problem entirely. "One impossible achievement at a time," Chen responded, her attention remaining on Petrova's tracking signal as it continued its steady progression through terrain that all conventional wisdom declared unsurvivable. On the ice, Petrova had entered the survival state familiar to elite Arctic explorers, a condition of focused efficiency where every movement, decision and physiological response was optimized for maximum endurance. Her specialized breathing techniques minimized heat loss in the brutal cold, while precisely timed nutrition and hydration maintained physical capability. Despite extreme energy expenditure, the satellite phone she carried activated with an incoming transmission from the research station. Despite deteriorating signal quality, Dr. Chen's voice came through with urgent information. "Elena, we've re-established partial communication with the team. Their situation is more critical than initially assessed. Primary shelter compromised in the collapse. Current protection insufficient for conditions. Estimated survival time reduced to approximately 8 hours. This updated information necessitated immediate recalculation. Petrova's current pace would bring her to their position in approximately 10 hours. Too late by the revised assessment." "Understand," she acknowledged tersely, implementing alternative approach. What followed represented perhaps the most extraordinary phase of her already unprecedented rescue attempt. Rather than maintaining the methodical pace that balanced speed against endurance, Petrova transitioned to what Arctic specialists called emergency traverse protocol, a high-risk approach that sacrificed safety margins and sustainable energy expenditure for maximum short-term speed. This methodology was considered viable only for final approaches in life-or-death scenarios, as it rapidly depleted physical reserves while increasing injury risk exponentially. For most explorers, attempting this protocol in current conditions would result in catastrophic failure. For Petrova, with her exceptional physical conditioning and technical precision, it represented the only mathematical possibility of reaching the team before their survival window closed. The tracking data at the research station reflected this dramatic shift in approach, with her movement rate nearly doubling despite deteriorating conditions. The monitoring team watched with professional concern, recognizing that she was pushing human performance boundaries well beyond established limitations. "She can't maintain that pace in these conditions," Harmon stated, his initial skepticism now transformed into genuine concern for her survival. "The physical demands would exhaust even the most conditioned explorer within 2 to 3 hours. Then we have to hope she reaches them within that time frame," Chen replied, her attention focused on both Petrova's tracker and the increasingly desperate communications from the stranded team. 26 hours after departing the research station, having navigated terrain considered impassable through conditions classified as unsurvivable, Elena Petrova approached the final barrier separating her from the stranded researchers, a newly formed crevasse created by the same ice shelf collapse that had trapped the team. The satellite imagery hadn't captured this feature's full extent, as it had been partially obscured by storm conditions and continuing ice movement. What Petrova found was a gaping chasm approximately 40 meters wide, far too extensive for conventional crossing methods given her available equipment. For any other rescuer, this would have represented the insurmountable final obstacle, mathematical proof that the rescue attempt, however valiant, had been doomed from the start. For Petrova, it represented a problem requiring immediate innovative solution rather than acceptance of defeat. Studying the crevasse formation with the accelerated assessment, developed through decades of Arctic experience, she identified a potential approach invisible to conventional analysis. The ice structure's collapse pattern had created a partial subsurface bridge, a tenuous connection hidden beneath overhanging formations that standard assessment would dismiss as non-viable. The crossing would require technical ice climbing skills at the absolute limit of human capability, performed in conditions that pushed far beyond established safety parameters. The probability calculations were stark, a significant chance of fatal failure, balanced against the certainty of the team's death. Without intervention, without hesitation, Petrova began implementing the crossing technique, using modified equipment in configurations never intended for such extreme applications. Each movement required perfect execution, with the consequences of even minor error being immediate and fatal. At the research station, the monitoring team watched her tracker position with increasing tension as her progress slowed at the crevasse location. The technical details of what she was attempting remained invisible to satellite observation, but the extended time at this obstacle location suggested she had encountered a potentially insurmountable barrier. "She stopped advancing," Harmon noted grimly. "The new crevasse formation must be more extensive than our imagery captured." For 17 agonizing minutes, Petrova's tracker remained stationary at the crevasse edge, creating the growing impression that the rescue attempt had finally encountered its limiting factor. Then, without warning, the signal began moving again, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as she completed the crossing and resumed her approach to the team's position. "She's across," Chen announced with undisguised astonishment. Whatever barrier she encountered, she's overcome it, and is now less than 2 kilometers from the team's location. The final approach to the stranded researchers represented both the culmination of Petrova's extraordinary journey and the beginning of an equally challenging extraction problem. Having pushed her physical resources to their limits during the emergency traverse protocol, she now faced the daunting task of not merely reaching the team, but implementing survival measures
that would extend their endurance until conventional rescue could arrive. As she crested the final ridge separating her from the team's position, the full scale of their predicament became visible even through the storm's limited visibility. The ice shelf collapse had created an isolated plateau, with the research team's damaged shelters providing minimal protection against conditions that had deteriorated beyond their equipment's design parameters. The team's reaction to her arrival transcended professional relief, bordering on disbelief that rescue had materialized in conditions they had calculated as making intervention impossible. The elite team leader, Dr. Marcus Reynolds, had maintained group discipline throughout the crisis, but his expression upon recognizing Petrova revealed both shock and the dawning realization of how completely they had underestimated her capabilities. How did he begin? The question dying as he took in her solo presence and the implications of what she had accomplished to reach them. Assessment indicated conventional rescue would arrive approximately 40 hours after your survival window, Petrova stated simply, already unpacking the specialized equipment she had transported. This approach offered the only viable mathematical probability. As she implemented the emergency survival protocols that would extend the team's endurance, the researchers who had previously dismissed her methodology as unnecessarily risky witnessed firsthand the expertise they had systematically undervalued. Her approach to their crisis situation reflected the same qualities that had defined her career: methodical precision, innovative adaptation to extreme conditions, and the quiet competence that transcended conventional limitation.
The Arctic storm had intensified to conditions classified as extreme survival threshold, the point at which even properly equipped expeditions initiated emergency protocols and suspended all non-essential operations. For the stranded elite team, with compromised equipment and rapidly depleting resources, these conditions represented a mathematical death sentence without immediate intervention. Elena Petrova's arrival, while seemingly miraculous to the desperate researchers, represented only the first phase of a comprehensive survival challenge. Having reached the team's position through terrain considered impassable, she now faced the equally daunting task of keeping 12 compromised individuals alive in conditions that pushed beyond established human endurance parameters. Current situation assessment. She requested from Dr. Reynolds her approach immediately establishing the methodical problem-solving framework that had defined her career. Reynolds, whose initial shock at her arrival had transformed into profound professional respect, provided a concise summary. Primary shelter catastrophically compromised during ice shelf collapse. Emergency systems operational at approximately 40% capacity. Medical status includes 3 researchers with moderate hypothermia, 1 with potential frostbite. Remainder stable but deteriorating. Supply reserves sufficient for approximately 7 hours at current consumption rates. Petrova processed this information with the accelerated calculation developed through decades of Arctic crisis management. Conventional rescue ETA. Approximately 28 hours at earliest opportunity. Survival gap of 21 hours minimum. This stark assessment, delivered with characteristic precision rather than emotional alarm, established the fundamental challenge. The team required nearly 3 times their current endurance capacity to survive until conventional extraction became possible. Under standard protocols, this mathematical gap would render the situation unrecoverable, despite Petrova having reached them. What followed demonstrated why her approach to Arctic operations transcended conventional methodology. Rather than accepting the limitations established by standard calculation, Petrova immediately began implementing the specialized extreme survival techniques she had developed throughout her career. Approaches considered theoretical or excessive by institute leadership but now representing the team's only possibility for survival. Implement immediate protocol adjustments, she directed, already unpacking the specialized equipment she had transported. Consolidated shelter configuration utilizing remaining structural elements. Modified thermal management system to extend heating capacity. Physiological conservation techniques to reduce individual consumption requirements. The elite team, comprised of researchers whose academic credentials were impeccable but whose practical extreme condition experience paled beside Petrova's, followed her directions with the immediate compliance of those recognizing superior expertise in life or death circumstance. Even Reynolds, who had previously supported the rejection of her solo expedition proposal, now deferred to her authority without hesitation. Petrova's approach to their survival challenge reflected the same innovative methodology that characterized her field research, systematically identifying limitations in conventional approaches and developing specialized alternatives that expanded established boundaries. Where standard protocols focused on equipment-dependent solutions, her techniques incorporated physiological adaptations, microenvironment manipulation, and resource optimization approaches developed through direct experience, rather than theoretical modeling. The shelter system she established utilized structural principles never incorporated into standard Arctic expedition equipment, a hybridized design that combined remaining conventional components with specialized adaptations she had transported. The resulting configuration created sustainable microclimate conditions that standard assessment would have deemed impossible with available resources. This thermal management approach isn't in any of our training protocols, observed James Collins, the team's environmental systems specialist, as he assisted with the implementation. Standard protocols assume conventional equipment configurations. Petrova responded while continuing her methodical construction. When operating beyond conventional parameters, alternative methodologies become viable. This simple statement encapsulated the fundamental divide that had defined her career at the Institute. The distinction between operating within established guidelines versus developing innovative approaches when existing methods proved insufficient. What her colleagues had dismissed as unnecessary risk-taking was revealed as sophisticated adaptation to challenges beyond conventional solutions. As the makeshift shelter system took form, Petrova simultaneously implemented the physiological conservation techniques that represented perhaps her most significant contribution to extreme environment survival. These specialized approaches, combining modified breathing methodologies, micro-movement efficiency, and metabolic regulation, enabled human endurance far beyond established limitations. These techniques require precise implementation. She instructed the team as she demonstrated the methodology. Conventional survival training emphasizes external protection. This approach incorporates internal physiological adaptation to extend endurance when external systems are compromised. The team's medical officer, Dr. Sarah Williams, observed the demonstrated techniques with professional amazement. These adaptations show measurable impact on core temperature maintenance and oxygen utilization efficiency. Why aren't these standard in our survival training? The question highlighted the institutional resistance that had consistently minimized Petrova's innovations, despite their demonstrated effectiveness. Throughout her career, her methodologies had been classified as unorthodox or excessive, rather than recognized as significant advancements in extreme environment survival. As the combined shelter and physiological protocols stabilized the team's immediate survival situation, Petrova established communication with the research station using the specialized equipment she had transported. The connection, though fragmented by storm interference, provided critical coordination with the conventional rescue operation now mobilizing. Petrova reporting from elite team position, she transmitted through the specialized frequency band. 12 researchers located implementing extended survival protocols. Current endurance projection. Approximately 30 hours with modified conservation measures. Dr. Chen's voice responded through static interference. Relief evident despite the tenuous connection. Elena. Conventional rescue mobilizing with maximum priority. Weather models indicate potential improvement in approximately 24 hours. Can you maintain position until extraction window? Affirmative, Petrova confirmed. Her assessment based on the specialized measures, now implemented rather than standard survival calculations, have established sustainable microenvironment with modified resource utilization. Team conditions stabilizing under adapted protocol. What remained unspoken in this exchange was the extraordinary nature of what Petrova had already accomplished, navigating terrain classified as impassable through conditions deemed unsurvivable, reaching a team given up for dead, implementing survival measures that extended endurance far beyond established human limitations. At the research station,
The tracking and communication data created a profound reassessment among those who had previously dismissed Petrova's methodology. The satellite imagery, supplemented by thermal analysis of the team's position, showed sustainable life signs in conditions that conventional assessment had calculated as unsurvivable, empirical evidence that her approach transcended established parameters. "She's actually stabilized their situation," Dr. Harmon acknowledged, studying the incoming data with growing amazement. "In conditions that exceeded survival threshold by every established measure." Dr. Chen's response reflected the reassessment occurring throughout the institute. "Perhaps our understanding of established measures requires revision when confronted with empirical results that contradict theoretical limitation." As the crucial hours passed, Petrova maintained the specialized survival system with the methodical precision that defined her operational approach. Despite having pushed her own physiological resources to their limits during the emergency traverse to reach the team, she continued functioning at a level that defied conventional endurance expectations, implementing the same conservation techniques she had taught the team while simultaneously managing the complex survival system. The elite team researchers, many of whom had previously considered themselves at the forefront of Arctic expertise, experienced a profound professional humbling as they witnessed Petrova's capabilities firsthand. The gap between theoretical knowledge and practical mastery became starkly apparent in the face of conditions that would have been fatal without her specialized intervention. "I reviewed your original expedition proposal," Reynolds admitted during a brief rest interval as the survival system maintained stable function. "The solo methodology we rejected as recklessly dangerous is precisely what enabled you to reach us when conventional approaches failed." Petrova acknowledged this reassessment with characteristic focus on practical outcomes rather than institutional validation. Different methodologies serve different operational requirements. Conventional approaches optimize for known variables. Solo methodology permits adaptation to conditions beyond established parameters. This diplomatically phrased explanation encompassed the fundamental innovation she had brought to Arctic research, the recognition that advancing beyond current knowledge sometimes required approaches that appeared risky when viewed through the lens of established practice. As the extraction window approached, weather conditions began showing the first indications of the predicted improvement, though improvement remained a relative term in an environment where ambient conditions still exceeded survival thresholds by conventional assessment. The storm intensity decreased marginally, creating potential opportunity for the conventional rescue operation, now positioned approximately 80 kilometers from the team's location. Extraction team reports operational window opening within approximately 4 hours. Petrova informed the researchers after her latest communication with the research station. Conditions remain classified as extreme, but helicopter approach now calculated as viable with specialized equipment. This update represented the first concrete hope for the elite team's survival beyond the extraordinary measures Petrova had implemented. The specialized survival system she had established had maintained 12 lives in conditions that should have proven fatal according to standard calculations, extending their endurance far beyond established limitation. Williams, monitoring the team's medical status with increasingly amazed assessment, approached Petrova during a brief maintenance interval. "Your physiological observation techniques have maintained core temperatures and vital functions at levels that contradict established medical parameters for these conditions," she observed. "The documented effects suggest significant advancement beyond current understanding of human adaptation to extreme environments." Petrova acknowledged this assessment with characteristic focus on practical application rather than theoretical implication. Physiological response can be systematically modified through specific protocols. The techniques represent accumulated adaptation rather than theoretical modeling. This simple explanation encapsulated the fundamental distinction between Petrova's approach and conventional research methodology: direct experiential development versus theoretical projection. What the Institute had dismissed as unnecessary risk-taking was revealed as sophisticated advancement beyond established limitation. As the extraction window approached, Petrova methodically prepared the team for transition to conventional rescue, systematically addressing the complex challenges of moving compromised individuals from their stabilized microenvironment to the extraction vehicle. Each aspect of the operation received the same meticulous planning that had characterized her entire approach, with contingencies established for all potential variables. Extraction protocol requires precise timing, she instructed the team during final preparation. The thermal transition from shelter to transport creates maximum vulnerability. Movement sequence must maintain physiological observation techniques throughout transition. The researchers, now fully recognizing the expertise they had previously undervalued, followed her instructions with disciplined precision. The profound respect that had developed during their survival situation reflected complete reassessment of both Petrova's methodology and the institutional barriers that had systematically minimized her innovation. When the extraction helicopters finally appeared through the marginal visibility, specialized Arctic rescue vehicles operating at the extreme edge of their operational parameters, the transfer operation proceeded with the methodical efficiency Petrova had planned. The elite team members were transitioned from the improvised shelter to the transport vehicles in carefully timed sequences that maintained the physiological protocols she had established. As the final researchers boarded, Reynolds turned to Petrova with the direct acknowledgement their professional relationship had previously lacked. What you accomplished here transcends any Arctic operation I've studied or participated in throughout my career. The Institute's assessment of your methodologies requires fundamental reconsideration. Petrova's response reflected her consistent focus on practical outcomes rather than institutional validation. All methodologies should be evaluated based on empirical results rather than conformity to established parameters. This simple statement represented both professional philosophy and implicit challenge to the institutional structures that had consistently undervalued her innovations, despite their demonstrated effectiveness. As the extraction operation completed and the helicopters departed with all team members safely aboard, Petrova remained briefly at the abandoned site, conducting a final assessment of the environmental conditions and survival system performance. This methodical documentation, gathering empirical data, even as conventional rescue withdrew, exemplified the rigorous approach that had defined her entire career. The return to the research station represented not merely the completion of an extraordinary rescue operation, but the beginning of a fundamental institutional reassessment. The empirical results of Petrova's methodology, 12 lives saved under conditions classified as unsurvivable by every conventional assessment, created an evidence-based challenge to established parameters that could not be dismissed through traditional institutional resistance.
International Polar Research Institute, Svalbard Station. 3 days later, the Institute's main conference center, typically reserved for formal research presentations, had been hastily repurposed for the extraordinary debriefing session now unfolding. Every available researcher, support staff member, and administrative personnel had assembled to witness what many were already describing as the most significant reassessment in the Institute's history. On the main presentation screens, satellite imagery displayed the route Petrova had navigated, a journey that technical analysis had initially classified as beyond human capability, given the conditions and terrain challenges. Beside this visual evidence, medical data from the rescued team members documented survival parameters that contradicted established physiological limitations for extreme environment endurance. Dr. Richard Harmon, whose dismissal of Petrova's methodology had nearly resulted in 12 deaths, addressed the assembled staff with the direct acknowledgement the situation demanded. The events of the past week require fundamental reconsideration of our operational assessment protocols, he stated. Professional integrity, overcoming institutional defensiveness. Dr. Petrova's successful intervention demonstrated capability parameters significantly beyond our established calculations. The elite team members, still recovering from their ordeal, but insistent on participating in this critical reassessment, provided first-hand testimony that transformed abstract data into compelling narrative. Dr. Reynolds, as team leader, spoke with the humbled perspective of someone whose understanding had been profoundly transformed through direct experience. What Dr. Petrova accomplished cannot be adequately conveyed through technical description, he stated, addressing his colleagues with uncharacteristic emotional emphasis. When conditions exceeded survivable parameters by every established measure, she implemented physiological and environmental adaptations, that expanded human capability beyond recognized limitations. Without her intervention and methodology, 12 researchers would have perished despite all conventional rescue efforts. Throughout this extraordinary recognition, Elena Petrova maintained the same composed professionalism that had characterized her entire career. When finally called upon to address the assembled institute personnel, she focused on operational implications rather than personal vindication. The Arctic environment consistently presents conditions beyond established parameters, she stated with characteristic precision. Effective research and survival methodology must incorporate adaptation rather than limitation. When conventional approaches prove insufficient, the events at Nordenskjold demonstrate not exceptional circumstances, but the fundamental reality of extreme environment operation. This assessment, framing her extraordinary achievement as systematic methodology rather than heroic exception, reflected the philosophical approach that had defined her career despite institutional resistance. Where the institute had consistently emphasized conformity to established protocols, Petrova had developed innovations that expanded capability beyond recognized limitation. Who had recognized Petrova's expertise even before the rescue operation validated it so dramatically, provided the contextual framework that many were still struggling to fully process. What we witnessed wasn't merely an exceptional rescue under impossible conditions, she explained to her colleagues. It represents systematic methodology that expands human capability in extreme environments beyond what our conventional assessment deemed possible. The implications for Arctic research, survival protocols, and operational parameters are profound and far-reaching. As the debriefing transitioned to technical analysis, the rescued researchers provided detailed documentation of the specialized techniques Petrova had implemented, the physiological conservation methods, microenvironment adaptations, and resource optimization approaches that had extended human endurance far beyond established limitations. Dr. Williams, the team's medical officer, presented preliminary analysis that particularly captured the Institute's attention. The physiological adaptation techniques Dr. Petrova implemented maintained core biological functions at levels our medical protocols classified as impossible under the documented conditions, she explained, displaying the compelling data. These methods represent significant advancement beyond current understanding of human adaptation to extreme environments. For the Institute's leadership, this empirical evidence created unavoidable institutional implications. The methodologies they had consistently dismissed as unnecessarily risky were now documented as life-saving innovations that expanded human capability beyond recognized limitation. This reality demanded fundamental reassessment of the institutional structures and assessment protocols that had systematically minimized Petrova's contributions despite their demonstrated effectiveness. Following the formal debriefing, the Institute's board of directors convened an emergency session to address the organizational implications. Their discussions, while private, resulted in announcements that signaled profound institutional transformation. In recognition of demonstrated expertise in extreme environment operations, the board's formal statement began. Elena Petrova is appointed Director of Advanced Arctic Methodology, with authority to establish specialized training protocols incorporating the techniques validated during the Nordenskjold rescue operation. This appointment, creating a leadership position specifically focused on Petrova's innovative approaches, represented institutional acknowledgement that transcended individual recognition. Beyond validating her personal expertise, it established formal incorporation of methodologies previously dismissed as outside acceptable parameters. For many of the Institute's younger researchers, particularly women who had encountered similar institutional barriers despite demonstrated capability, this transformation represented more than organizational restructure. It validated an approach to scientific advancement that emphasized empirical results over conformity to established parameters, expanding the boundaries of recognized possibility through demonstrated achievement rather than theoretical limitation. Chan, joining Petrova as she prepared to implement her new directorial responsibilities, expressed what many were feeling but few had articulated directly. Beyond the lives saved and the methodologies validated, she observed, your achievement challenged the institutional structures that consistently undervalued certain forms of expertise despite empirical evidence.
Petrova acknowledged this broader implication, with characteristic focus on practical outcomes, rather than institutional politics. Effective science requires evidence-based assessment regardless of whether results conform to established expectations. She replied, "The Arctic environment provides immediate empirical validation that transcends institutional preference." This straightforward philosophy, privileging demonstrated results over theoretical conformity, encapsulated the approach that had defined Petrova's career despite systematic resistance. What the Nordenskjöld rescue had provided was not merely validation of her individual expertise, but empirical evidence that could not be dismissed through conventional institutional mechanisms. In the weeks that followed, Petrova's methodology transition from controversial exception to established protocol proceeded with remarkable speed. The specialized techniques she had developed throughout her career, previously marginalized as unorthodox or excessively risky, were systematically documented, analyzed and incorporated into the Institute's operational guidelines. Reynolds, whose perspective had perhaps undergone the most profound transformation, worked closely with Petrova to integrate her approaches into the elite team's future expedition planning. The physiological conservation techniques alone represent significant advancement beyond current Arctic operational methodology, he acknowledged during a planning session. Combined with your microenvironment adaptation approach, they expand operational parameters beyond what we previously considered possible. Petrova accepted this professional recognition with the same focused attention to practical application that had characterized her response to previous institutional dismissal. Her concern remained advancement of effective methodology, rather than personal validation or institutional politics. 6 months after the Nordenskjöld incident, as Petrova prepared to lead a specialized training expedition, implementing her methodology on a broader scale, the Institute's transformation had extended beyond internal protocols to influence Arctic research approaches internationally. The techniques she had developed, now documented through rigorous analysis and peer review, were being adopted by research organizations worldwide, expanding human capability in extreme environments beyond previously established limitations. For Elena Petrova herself, this institutional and international recognition represented validation of an approach she had maintained despite systematic resistance throughout her career. The methodologies, dismissed as unnecessarily risky, were now acknowledged as significant advancements beyond conventional limitations, expanding human capability through innovative adaptation, rather than restriction, to established parameters. As she reviewed the final preparation for the upcoming training expedition, which would include researchers from 5 countries seeking to learn her specialized techniques, Petrova reflected briefly on the journey from institutional marginalization to methodology validation. The fundamental lesson transcended Arctic research or survival protocols. Effective advancement sometimes requires moving beyond established limitations, even when that approach encounters institutional resistance. The transformation her methodology had created extended beyond technical protocols or survival techniques to influence the Institute's fundamental approach to expertise assessment and innovation development. The rigid hierarchies and gendered assumptions that had previously limited recognition of demonstrated capability were being systematically replaced with evidence-based evaluation that privileged empirical results over institutional preference. For the younger female researchers now joining Petrova's specialized training program, this transformation represented opportunity beyond technical skill development. It validated an approach to scientific advancement that emphasized demonstrated achievement over conformity to institutional expectations, expanding the boundaries of recognized possibility through empirical evidence, rather than theoretical limitation.
International Polar Research Conference, Stockholm. 1 year later, the Grand Auditorium of Stockholm Science Academy fell silent as Elena Petrova approached the podium to deliver the conference's keynote address. Before her sat the most distinguished gathering of polar researchers in the world, assembled to hear her presentation on what had become known in scientific circles as the Petrova methodology. Effective operation in extreme Arctic environments requires fundamental recalibration of conventional limitations. Petrova began her presentation style reflecting the same precise efficiency that characterized her field methodology. Human capability parameters can be systematically expanded through specialized adaptation techniques when standard approaches prove insufficient. On the large screens behind her, sophisticated data visualization displayed the practical implementation of her methodology. Physiological conservation techniques, microenvironment adaptation approaches, and resource optimization systems that expanded human capability beyond previously established limitations in extreme conditions. In the front row, representatives from research organizations worldwide watched with focused attention, including the International Polar Research Institute's leadership team. Dr. Harmon, whose dismissal of Petrova's expedition proposal had nearly resulted in tragedy, now displayed the attentive respect of someone who had experienced a profound paradigm shift through empirical evidence. The Nordesentiode incident demonstrated capability parameters significantly beyond conventional assessment. Petrova continued, diplomatically referencing the rescue operation without emphasizing the institutional failures that had preceded it. When conditions exceed standard operational thresholds, specialized methodologies can maintain function through systematic adaptation rather than equipment dependence. This measured description of what had been in reality an extraordinary expansion of recognized human capability drew knowing responses from many of the experienced field researchers present. The scientific publications had been less restrained, with analyses describing revolutionary advancement in extreme environment human capability and fundamental reassessment of established physiological limitations in Arctic conditions. As Petrova outlined the technical specifications of her methodology, research organizations in the exhibition hall were already showcasing equipment and protocols specifically designed to implement her approaches, specialized systems that incorporated her innovations into standardized field operations worldwide. Chen, now directing the Institute's Advanced Methodology Integration Program, joined Petrova following the presentation. Your protocols have been implemented by 17 international research organizations, she informed her colleague with evident satisfaction. The physiological observation techniques alone have expanded operational parameters by approximately 40% beyond previous limitations. Petrova acknowledged this professional validation with characteristic focus on practical application rather than personal recognition. Effective methodology should be widely implemented rather than institutionally restricted. The techniques represent systematic adaptation to environmental realities rather than theoretical innovation. This modest assessment of what had been described in conference materials as the most significant advancement in Arctic operational capability in decades reflected Petrova's consistent emphasis on practical outcomes rather than professional accolades. Dr. Reynolds, whose elite team now incorporated Petrova's methodology as standard protocol, approached with several researchers from international organizations. The navigation techniques you developed have transformed our approach to terrain previously classified as impassable, he informed her. The combination of microfeature recognition and adaptive traverse methodology has expanded operational range beyond conventional limitations in multiple expedition contexts. Indeed, what had begun as specialized techniques developed by a single innovative researcher had evolved into comprehensive methodology adoption across the polar research community. The approaches Petrova had refined throughout her career, frequently marginalized as unnecessarily risky, despite demonstrated effectiveness, were now standard protocol for operations in extreme Arctic conditions. Harmon joined the group, his previous dismissive attitude replaced by professional acknowledgement that transcended institutional politics. The Institute has completely revised our operational assessment protocols based on empirical validation of your methodology, he stated direct. The parameters we previously classified as excessive risk have been recategorized as advanced adaptation techniques, following documented effectiveness. This institutional transformation represented perhaps the most significant aspect of Petrova's legacy, not merely the adoption of her specific techniques, but fundamental reassessment of how innovation beyond established parameters was evaluated and incorporated. The rigid hierarchies and gendered assumptions that had previously limited recognition of demonstrated capability were being systematically replaced with evidence-based assessment
that privileged empirical results over institutional preference. Later that evening, at a reception for distinguished conference presenters, Petrova was approached by a group of early career female researchers whose professional trajectories had been directly influenced by her achievements and methodology. "Your work has transformed institutional barriers beyond technical protocols," one young scientist stated with direct appreciation. "The evidence-based validation of your approaches challenged assessment structures that consistently undervalued certain forms of expertise, despite demonstrated effectiveness." Petrova considered this broader implication with thoughtful assessment. "Scientific advancement requires evidence-based evaluation, regardless of whether results conform to established expectations," she replied. "Institutional parameters should adapt to empirical evidence rather than restricting methodology to conventional limitations." This straightforward philosophy, privileging demonstrated results over theoretical conformity, encapsulated the approach that had defined her career, despite systematic resistance. What the Nordenskjöld rescue and subsequent methodology validation had provided was not merely professional recognition, but fundamental transformation in how innovation beyond established parameters was evaluated and incorporated. As the conference concluded, and implementation of Petrova's methodology continued expanding worldwide, her influence extended beyond specific techniques to reshape fundamental approaches to Arctic research, survival protocols, and operational parameters. The specialized adaptations she had developed throughout her career were now enabling scientific advancement in environments previously considered beyond sustainable human operation. For Elena Petrova herself, this transformation represented validation of an approach she had maintained, despite institutional resistance throughout her career. The methodologies, dismissed as unnecessarily risky, were now acknowledged as significant advancements beyond conventional limitations, expanding human capability through innovative adaptation, rather than restriction to established parameters. As she prepared for her next field expedition, now leading an international research team implementing her methodology in previously inaccessible Arctic regions, Petrova reflected briefly on the journey from institutional marginalization to scientific validation. The fundamental lesson transcended polar research or survival protocols. Effective advancement sometimes requires moving beyond established limitations, even when that approach encounters systematic resistance. The transformation her methodology had created extended beyond technical protocols or operational parameters to influence how innovation itself was conceptualized and evaluated. The rigid categorizations and gendered assumptions that had previously limited recognition of demonstrated capability were being systematically replaced with evidence-based assessment that privileged empirical results over institutional preference. For the younger researchers, now implementing Petrova's methodology worldwide, this transformation represented opportunity beyond technical advancement. It validated an approach to scientific innovation that emphasized demonstrated achievement over conformity to established expectations, expanding the boundaries of recognized possibility through empirical evidence rather than theoretical limitation. If this incredible story of an underestimated Arctic researcher saving lives in impossible conditions captured your imagination, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Have you ever seen someone prove everyone wrong through extraordinary skill and determination? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and would love to hear your stories. Do you think we still underestimate people based on gender or background rather than actual ability? Let us know. And don't forget to turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you never miss our daily uploads of extraordinary true stories that remind us heroes often hide in plain sight.